King Charles had just discovered the one file he never expected to find inside his own home, a secret succession plan built entirely without him, and it carried his heir's name across every page. What began as a routine handover of Scottish titles to William turned within moments into a quiet and devastating reckoning inside Buckingham Palace. Charles had faced rebellion, scandal, and betrayal before, but nothing had prepared him for evidence that his own wife had been shaping his son's future in secret. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next royal investigation. Stories like this rarely end where they begin. Looking back now, the warning signs were always there. Most people just weren't paying close enough attention, and to understand how one folder brought a monarchy to the edge, we have to return to a single closed door at Windsor months before anyone realized what was already being built. The folder had been placed in front of King Charles without ceremony, without warning, and without a single word of explanation. He had expected paperwork about William's new Scottish titles, another quiet formality, in a long procession of royal transitions. Instead, he found himself staring at pages he had never approved, never requested, and never been told existed. A senior courtier stood at a careful distance watching the king's hands remain still over the folder as if movement itself might confirm what he already suspected. Inside were succession planning documents, meaning the formal blueprint for how royal authority would one day pass from him to his son. Such documents belonged by tradition and by law to the sovereign and his heir alone. Yet these had been built somewhere else entirely, under an authority that was not his. Charles turned the first page and stopped breathing for a long moment. Written across the margin in handwriting he recognized instantly was a note bearing William's name beside a proposal he had never seen. The king removed his glasses slowly and set them beside the folder, as though distance might soften what the page in front of him refused to soften. He did not raise his voice. He did not summon anyone. He simply read the same paragraph twice, then a third time, searching for a version of the sentence that might mean something less alarming than what it plainly said. There was none. The words remained exactly what they appeared to be, a plan for the future of the monarchy drafted without the two men whose future it most directly concerned. The investigation that produced this folder had not begun that morning. It had started weeks earlier, quietly after unusual requests for succession records and constitutional briefings were traced back to Queen Camilla's household. What had once been a routine security inquiry had now reached its conclusion inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, and the conclusion was worse than anyone investigating it had expected. Charles turned another page. One proposal outlined a temporary advisory council to be activated during any period in which the king could no longer perform his duties. Camilla was named at the center of it, not as a supporting presence, but as the figure who would control what William was told when he was told it, and who would be permitted to stand beside him when authority shifted. The king read the passage a second time, and something in his expression changed in a way the courtier in the room would later struggle to describe. The next page cut even deeper. William's access to sensitive briefings, the very information a future king would need to lead, had been quietly restricted pending unnamed conditions. The heir to the throne, a man who had spent his entire adult life preparing for this responsibility, had not been treated as someone stepping into power. He had been treated as a risk requiring containment. Charles pressed one finger against a line where Camilla had written a single instruction in her own handhold until review. He stared at those 4 words longer than he had stared at anything else in the folder. Then he reached the page that changed the room entirely, a page that had nothing to do with William at all. It concerned Prince George and a private ceremonial roll designed to bind the child symbolically to the transition of power long before that transition was ever meant to happen. No one had approved it. No parent had been asked. Charles closed the folder halfway, his hand still resting on its cover, unwilling to let it go and unable to keep reading. Somewhere beyond the walls of that room, a wife believed she had been protecting a fragile future. What Charles now held in his hands told a very different story, one he would have to confront before the day was over, and one that would not stay contained behind palace doors for long. The folder did not stay in one room for long. Within hours, its contents had reached 3 people whose lives it had quietly rearranged without their knowledge, and each of them received the truth in a different way, shaped by who they were and what they stood to lose. Charles felt it first as a private wound deeper than politics and deeper than protocol. He had always believed the monarchy could only survive if it passed to William with stability and public confidence intact, a promise between generations, not merely a transfer of titles. Now that promise had been quietly rewritten by the one person who had stood beside him longer than almost anyone else. He sat alone for a long while after the initial discovery, turning over a single question he could not yet bring himself to ask aloud. Had this come from fear, or had it come from ambition dressed as loyalty? William received the news differently and far more sharply. He entered the private room where his father waited without speaking, already sensing from the stillness in the air that something fundamental had shifted. He read the pages, describing him as emotionally unpredictable during a future transition, recommending that selected advisors control his earliest decisions as king. He read them once, then a second time, his hand tightening slowly around the back of a nearby chair. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost dangerously calm. He asked who had approved it. Charles did not answer immediately. That silence, more than any words, could have confirmed what William already feared, that the betrayal reached further than one document and deeper than he had first understood. For a man who had spent years accepting that every choice he made would eventually be judged, being described as a danger to be managed rather than a king to be prepared was a wound that no title could soften. Catherine learned of it last and differently still. William explained it to her quietly in a private family room without interruption, laying out the proposed restrictions, the advisory structure, and the notes concerning their household. She listened with the composure she had trained herself to hold through every public and private crisis the family had faced. That composure held steady until George's name entered the conversation. Something in her expression changed instantly and permanently. She asked without raising her voice that George, Charlotte, and Louis be kept entirely away from any palace discussion connected to the investigation, whatever it ultimately revealed. There was something else Catherine had not yet been told, and would only learn later, that Camilla had written about her as well, describing her not as a source of strength for the monarchy, but as a figure whose public popularity could overshadow William during the earliest, most fragile days of his reign. It was not protection Camilla had extended toward Catherine in those notes. It was containment. 3 people, 3 private reactions, and one shared realization forming slowly beneath each of them that the folder was not an isolated mistake or a single lapse in judgment. It represented months of quiet planning conducted entirely outside the family it claimed to be protecting. Charles carried the weight of a marriage suddenly shadowed by suspicion. William carried the sting of having his own future discussed without his presence in the room. Catherine carried a mother's instinct to shield her children from something she did not yet fully understand. None of them said so directly, but each privately began asking the same unanswered question: how long had this been building, and how had it gone unnoticed for so long? The folder gave them fragments, dates, initials, proposals, but not the beginning. That beginning was still buried, waiting in a moment none of them had thought to revisit until now. Every fracture inside a royal family has a moment that looks unremarkable until it is examined afterward in hindsight with the full weight of everything that followed. For Charles, William, and Camilla, that moment took place months earlier inside a closed rehearsal room at Windsor during what should have been a routine test of protocol. Charles had approved a private succession continuity rehearsal, a confidential exercise designed to test how authority would pass in the event of a sudden emergency. It mattered more than most people outside the palace understood. A single mistake in such a moment could create public confusion, damage confidence in the monarchy, and weaken a future king before his reign had even properly begun. The rehearsal involved William's senior advisors and a small circle of constitutional staff. Camilla expected to be part of the final briefing. She had reason to expect it. Her position beside Charles had for years granted her a place inside nearly every significant royal discussion. This one concerned the household's emergency response, its communication strategy, and the delicate matter of how the public would be told if the king could no longer lead. Camilla believed reasonably, by her own account, that she was entitled to understand what would happen if Charles could no longer stand beside her. Charles reached a different conclusion, and he reached it quietly without consulting her first. Moments before the final session began, he turned to an aide and said the room would remain limited to himself and William alone. He asked for the doors to be closed. William heard the instruction and said nothing, understanding, at least in part, why his father wanted direct and uncomplicated control over the exercise. He did not yet understand how differently Camilla would experience the same decision. She arrived a short time later and found the doors already sealed. She could hear voices continuing on the other side, low and steady, discussing a future she had just been quietly excluded from. No aide stepped forward to invite her in. No one offered an explanation. Camilla stood there in silence for a long moment, then turned and walked away before anyone nearby could witness what was building beneath her composure. That evening, away from staff and away from cameras, she confronted Charles directly. She asked him plainly why she had been shut out of a conversation about the monarchy's own survival. Charles answered that the crown needed to pass from sovereign to heir without what he called emotional interference. His words were measured, careful, entirely constitutional in tone. The wound they created was immediate, and it was personal in a way no explanation could undo. Camilla removed a bracelet from her wrist and set it down sharply on the dressing table between them. She told him he had made her responsible for supporting the monarchy for years, while now denying her any voice in what would happen after he was gone. Charles insisted the decision had been about principle, not about her. She did not believe him, and something in the room shifted permanently that night. Within 48 hours, quiet requests began appearing across the household for emergency access protocols for regency precedents for private schedules connected to William's future role. A regency in constitutional terms is the legal arrangement used when a sovereign cannot perform official duties. One member of Camilla's household opened the very first file under an unremarkable label, continuity planning. No one who saw it that day understood what it would eventually become or how far it would eventually reach. There were no advisors in the room this time, no cameras beyond the walls, and no ceremonial language left for either of them to hide behind. Charles entered the private drawing room carrying the investigation folder himself, refusing to let anyone else carry it for him. Camilla was already seated waiting, as though she had known this conversation was only a matter of time. He placed the folder on the table between them and asked a single question without preamble and without softening it in any way. Were you preparing for my death, or were you preparing to control what came after me? The question hung in the room longer than either of them expected, and the answer that eventually came would strip away the last quiet protection surrounding their marriage. Charles had ordered every aide to leave before he entered, wanting the truth, without prepared statements, without legal caution, without palace language standing between them. The folder itself contained the official findings, private record, staff accounts, internal correspondence assembled with a thoroughness that told Camilla immediately this was no longer something her office could quietly explain away. He turned first to the pages restricting William's access to future briefings and demanded to know why his son had been treated as a danger rather than as the lawful heir preparing to lead. Camilla answered without flinching, insisting that William's open hostility toward her could destabilize the monarchy during a vulnerable transition, and that someone had to prepare for a crisis Charles himself had always refused to discuss aloud. Charles pushed the folder further across the table. Camilla did not touch it. She gripped the arm of her chair instead and told him plainly that his silence over the years had forced others to plan around fear, uncertainty, and a future no one in the family was permitted to name. Then, during the private conversation Charles had specifically requested be recorded for the investigation, Camilla admitted directly that the files had been created under her authority. She did not deny it, but she also insisted the harshest recommendations, the ones targeting William most severely, had come from advisors who feared he would remove them the moment he inherited the throne, men and women who believed they would be blamed for every failure of the previous reign, whether or not it was deserved. Charles turned next to the section concerning George. The proposal called for the child to be given a symbolic public role during the transition, one designed to create pressure around family unity before William could ever challenge the arrangement. A symbolic role in constitutional terms carries emotional weight without any formal power attached to it. Camilla had approved the discussion surrounding it. This was the point at which the king's restraint finally broke entirely. He told her that planning for continuity was one thing. Using his grandson as leverage inside a succession strategy was something no fear, however genuine, could ever defend. George was a child, not a symbol to be positioned. William was his heir, not an obstacle standing in the way of anyone's security. Camilla lowered her voice at that point, and what she said next reframed everything Charles believed he now understood. One complete copy of the plan, she admitted, had already left her household. It had been sent to someone outside her immediate circle, someone capable of activating parts of it independently without her further involvement or control. The confrontation had exposed Camilla's fear in full, but it had also opened a far more dangerous question than either of them had walked into the room prepared to face. Who now held that outside copy, and how much authority had quietly already been placed behind it? The files did not belong to Camilla alone, and Charles understood that almost immediately. Behind the emotional betrayal sat a colder, more structural problem. A network of advisors, private secretaries, and legal consultants who had quietly concluded that William's reign might erase their influence overnight, and who had begun preparing accordingly long before anyone in the family knew it was happening. Investigators traced the outside copy of the plan to a constitutional consultant, a specialist retained to advise on how royal authority could legally operate within existing tradition and law. That consultant had been asked discreetly to examine whether Camilla could retain a formal advisory position during the earliest stage of William's reign. The answer they were building toward was already taking shape on paper. Draft language had been prepared to present her continued involvement not as personal influence, but as an act of national stability, a framing designed so that her control would never need to be announced as power. It would simply be described as duty. The pressure inside the palace reached its breaking point during an emergency council meeting. Charles placed one marked page directly in front of his senior private secretary and asked without any diplomatic softening why George's ceremonial schedule had been circulated without parental approval. The official hesitated, visibly searching for a version of events that might sound less damaging than the truth. Charles did not allow the hesitation to stand. He demanded a direct answer. The secretary eventually admitted in a statement later entered formally into the investigation that the schedule had been shared during a planning discussion led by advisors connected to Camilla. The justification offered was that George's symbolic role would reassure a nervous public during any future transition. William, hearing this secondhand, understood the truth far more clearly than the explanation intended. His son had been quietly positioned as a tool meant to soften resistance and make an otherwise controversial plan appear emotionally untouchable to critics. Charles now understood the deeper mechanism at work. The succession files had depended on access to medical schedules, constitutional advice, security planning, and confidential announcement procedures, material that only a small circle of senior officials could have gathered without triggering an immediate internal alarm. The king recognized with a kind of quiet fury he rarely allowed himself to show that members of his own household had come to view his health not as a private matter to be protected, but as an opportunity to be positioned around. He gave the order to dismantle the entire network. Access to sensitive files was frozen immediately. Ongoing meetings connected to the plan were suspended without warning. Names tied to the proposals began quietly disappearing from future planning documents. For a moment it seemed as though the crisis might still be contained entirely within palace walls, resolved through internal procedure rather than public reckoning. But the order, however decisive, had come later than it needed to. Before the final instructions could be fully completed and enforced, details of the investigation had already begun slipping beyond the palace gates, carried by someone whose loyalty had clearly shifted elsewhere. The machinery Charles had just ordered dismantled had already set something else in motion, something now moving well beyond his control. The first leak did not reveal everything. It revealed only enough to cause panic, which in some ways made it more dangerous than the full truth would have been. A national broadcaster learned that secret succession documents had been seized from within Camilla's household, and within hours every silence inside the palace had become suspicious to someone watching from the outside. Palace communications staff received advance warning that the report was coming. It would focus on unauthorized succession planning preparations made without the approval of either the sovereign or the lawful heir. That distinction carried real weight. Even the appearance of a hidden power structure operating inside the monarchy could damage public trust at precisely the moment unity mattered most. Charles moved quickly, understanding that hesitation would look indistinguishable from weakness. He restricted access to the most sensitive files across the household. He suspended 3 officials directly connected to the plan. He transferred all remaining transition planning to a newly formed joint team approved jointly by himself and William, ensuring no single figure could ever again build something like this in isolation. Every decision was necessary. Every decision also pushed Camilla further from him. She received the outcome through a formal written notice from the royal household stating plainly that her private office would no longer retain access to constitutional advice or succession material of any kind. Camilla read the notice twice. She folded it carefully, deliberately, and remained seated long after everyone else in the room had gone. She had been publicly reduced in effect before Charles had ever fully sat down to hear the fear that had driven her actions in the first place. William watched the consequences unfold with conflicted emotions he did not fully share with anyone at first. He wanted accountability. The files had targeted him, directly involved his son without permission, and questioned his fitness to eventually lead. But he also feared quietly that humiliating Camilla too completely would deepen his father's isolation rather than heal it. Charles had weathered public pressure and scandal before. Watching trust collapse inside his own marriage was something else entirely, and William was not certain his father would recover from both at once. Catherine found her husband still awake well after midnight, turning the situation over without resolution. William admitted to her that he no longer knew whether protecting his father meant defending him from Camilla or stopping him from quietly destroying the marriage himself through unchecked anger. Catherine reminded him gently but firmly that mercy without any limits would only invite the same danger to return later in a different form, while punishment without any compassion risked breaking Charles completely at a moment he could least afford it. The investigation soon confirmed something that complicated the picture further. The harshest language used against William in the files had originally been written by Camilla's advisors, not by Camilla herself. But she had reviewed the completed document and approved it without removing the accusations aimed at her stepson. That single choice, investigators noted, made her responsible for the outcome regardless of how the process had first begun. Charles formally canceled the proposed advisory council. He destroyed its draft authority entirely and ordered George's name removed from every unauthorized document connected to the plan. The machinery at last had been stopped. Then he sent one final private message to William, a request to meet without aides, without legal staff, and without a single prepared statement between them. Not as sovereign and heir this time, but simply as father and son with everything still left to say. Charles chose Clarence House for the conversation rather than a formal palace office, and the choice mattered more than it might have seemed. Clarence House was his private London residence, a place tied more closely to family life than to royal command, and he wanted nothing standing between them that resembled ceremony. He wanted honesty, even if that honesty caused pain neither of them could fully prepare for. William arrived expecting instructions the way he had arrived at nearly every difficult meeting of his adult life. Instead, he found two chairs facing each other and a handwritten note asking him simply to speak freely. He sat down. For a long moment, neither man said anything at all. They had both spent years learning how to manage crises in public with composure and careful language. Neither of them had ever been taught how to admit fear to one another quietly without an audience. Charles broke the silence first. He confessed that he had avoided detailed succession discussions for years, not out of neglect, but because speaking about his own incapacity made it feel as though his family was already quietly preparing to live without him. Every rehearsal, he admitted, every emergency plan, every careful question about the future had sounded to him like a slow, formal farewell he was not ready to hear, spoken aloud. It was the first time he had said this to anyone, including Camilla. William listened without interrupting something that had not come naturally to him in recent weeks. Then he offered his own admission, one that had clearly cost him something to arrive at. His guarded, distant behavior toward Camilla over the years, he said, had likely helped create the very fear that convinced her she needed protection from him in the first place. He did not excuse what she had built in secret, but he accepted for the first time openly that years of cold distance on his part had shaped how she came to see her own future. Charles reached across the table and placed his hand over the note he had written earlier that morning. He told his son that protecting Camilla could never again require weakening William, and it could never again involve George in any capacity. The boy was not a symbol to be positioned for anyone's security, and he was not a threat to be managed or contained. That boundary, Charles said, would not move again under any circumstance. Then the king offered William something he had never fully offered before: immediate, unrestricted access to every transition document in the household, along with direct leadership of an entirely new succession framework. A succession framework, in practical terms, was the clear structure that would govern how authority, duties, and public responsibility would eventually pass to the next sovereign. This time, Charles said nothing about it would be hidden from him. William accepted, but on one condition of his own. Camilla would receive dignity, personal security, and continued respect within the family. But she would hold no independent authority whatsoever over how the crown was transferred now or in the future. Charles accepted without argument, without hesitation, and without asking for time to consider it further. Father and son had reached at last a shared understanding. Neither private resentment nor institutional fear would be permitted to shape constitutional policy again. Their unity had been quietly repaired behind closed doors, but the public verdict on everything that had happened was only just beginning to form, and it would not wait much longer to arrive. By morning, what had been a private crisis inside the palace had become a national conversation playing out across every major outlet. Newspapers placed Camilla's name directly beside the word succession. Broadcasters debated at length whether what had happened reflected genuine fear or calculated ambition. Crowds began gathering outside royal residences, watching for any sign of movement behind the gates, waiting for a response that had not yet come. The palace released a formal statement confirming that unauthorized succession planning materials had been discovered within the household and that every related proposal connected to them had since been canceled. The statement emphasized constitutional stability, the continued lawful operation of the monarchy without confusion over where authority genuinely rested. It was carefully worded to protect that stability. What it did not do was deny Camilla's direct involvement, and that single omission told the public everything the statement itself declined to say outright. A live broadcaster summarized the unfolding story as a conflict between marital loyalty and lawful succession, and the phrase spread quickly across television and radio throughout the day, repeated in nearly every subsequent report. Supporters of Camilla argued she had acted out of genuine terror that she would be abandoned once Charles was gone. Left with no protection and no place inside a family she had spent years defending publicly. Critics answered just as forcefully that private fear, however real, could never justify a secret attempt to shape and constrain William's future reign. Camilla watched the coverage alone in a quiet room without staff nearby. She turned off the television the moment a commentator described the plan as a hidden power grab, unable to sit through language that stripped away every explanation she still privately believed. She asked an aide quietly whether Charles had seen the same headline circulating. The aide confirmed that he had. She asked nothing further after that, and the silence in the room afterwards said more than any question could have. Charles understood the danger the coverage posed almost immediately. If he appeared divided from William in public even briefly, the scandal would deepen into something closer to a genuine crisis of confidence in the monarchy itself. If instead he stood visibly beside his son, the message would be unmistakable to anyone watching that the crown would continue moving forward through lawful succession, not through private pressure exercised behind closed doors. International reaction followed quickly, with commentators abroad framing the story as evidence of deeper strain inside the royal family, while others cautioned against reading too much into a single internal dispute. Royal historians were invited onto multiple programs to explain in careful terms what a succession framework actually meant and why any attempt to alter it outside proper channels carried such serious weight. The explanations rarely slowed the speculation. What the public did not yet know was that Charles and William had already reached their private resolution the night before quietly at Clarence House, long before the first headline appeared. The world was still forming its judgment in real time based on fragments. The family behind the scenes had already moved past judgment and into decision, and that decision was about to become visible in a way no statement could fully explain. William appeared beside his father at a scheduled royal engagement that same afternoon, and neither man said a single word about the files, the investigation, or the headlines still circulating across every major outlet. They did not need to. Their proximity to one another did the speaking neither of them was prepared to do publicly, and it did so more effectively than any statement the palace could have released. The prince stayed close to the king throughout the engagement, matching his pace, standing near enough that the distance between them read to anyone watching closely as a deliberate and unmistakable signal. Photographers captured the two of them walking together unhurried, neither man glancing toward the cameras positioned along the route. It was not a moment designed for drama. It was designed quietly and precisely to communicate stability at the exact point where stability had been most publicly questioned. Camilla did not attend. Her absence was noted almost immediately by observers stationed outside the venue, and it spread across live commentary within minutes. No official explanation accompanied it. None was offered and none was expected. The family had already reached its private decision the night before, and Camilla's absence from this particular appearance was simply the first visible sign of where that decision had settled. For those watching closely, the walking order carried its own quiet meaning. Charles and William, positioned near one another without a third figure standing between them, told a story that no commentator needed to narrate aloud. The public had spent days debating loyalty, fear, and constitutional overreach in the abstract. Here, in a single unremarkable public appearance, the abstract became visible. Royal observers noted the shift immediately in their coverage that evening, remarking on how differently the father and son carried themselves compared to recent appearances where visible strain had occasionally shown through practiced composure. This time there was none of that visible tension. What replaced it was something closer to quiet resolve, the kind that comes only after a difficult conversation has already taken place somewhere private, far from any camera. Camilla's absence would not on its own alter her formal title or her place within the family, but it marked something more lasting than any single public appearance could capture. It signaled, without a single official word being spoken, that her role within the machinery of succession had already changed permanently, and that the family had quietly begun moving forward without waiting for her presence to confirm it. By evening, the image of Charles and William walking together, composed and unified, had replaced the earlier headlines as the defining picture of the entire crisis. It offered no explanation of what had happened behind palace doors. It did not need to. It simply confirmed visually and unmistakably where the monarchy's authority now rested, and it left one final unresolved question hanging over everything that would follow: what exactly would become of Camilla's place inside a family she had spent years trying in her own way to protect. Charles summoned Camilla for one final private conversation. Once the network around her had been fully dismantled, the advisors removed from their positions, and William's authority formally restored. The secret files no longer existed in any usable form. What remained was simply the truth between a husband and a wife, and the question of whether their marriage could survive without the influence she had quietly tried to secure for herself. Charles placed the completed investigation summary on the table between them and waited until she was seated before speaking. The document recorded the official findings in full: who had authorized the planning, which powers had been proposed, and precisely which boundaries had been broken along the way. He told her plainly that he would continue to protect her dignity as his wife, but he would never again allow her to manage the crown beyond the years of his own reign. Camilla did not argue the point. During their recorded private conversation, she admitted that the exclusion at Windsor had awakened a fear she had carried quietly for years: that once Charles was gone, she would become unwanted, unprotected, and gradually erased from a family she had spent her adult life trying to defend and support. That fear, she said, had pushed her to build security in secret, in a place where trust should have been enough on its own. Charles listened without interrupting, but he did not soften the conclusion he had already reached. He told her that fear could explain what she had done. It could not excuse it. Trust, he said, could only return if she accepted a future entirely without constitutional influence, the ability to shape how royal authority passed from one sovereign to the next. That power belonged without exception to the lawful line of succession and to no one standing beside it. Camilla surrendered all access to transition planning that same day. She disbanded the private advisory circle that had built the original files, and she agreed without further resistance that William and Catherine alone would control every future decision involving George, Charlotte, and Louis. Her place within the family remained intact. Her reach beyond it did not. William received the final written summary from his father shortly afterward. He did not describe what had happened as forgiveness, and he never used that word in reference to Camilla again. He called it instead a stable boundary, one that protected his father's marriage, secured his own future as heir, and kept his children permanently beyond the reach of anyone's private strategy, however well-intentioned it may have first seemed. The investigation in the end revealed something about the monarchy that no external threat ever could have exposed so clearly. Its deepest danger had never come from public scandal or outside attack. It had come from private fear, quietly disguised as loyalty, built in secret by people who believed they were protecting the family even as they undermined it from within. Charles chose his son's lawful future over silence, and over the comfort of avoiding a difficult conversation for even one more year. William secured that future without destroying the father who had ultimately chosen to hand it to him honestly. And Camilla, in the end, remained within the family only after surrendering the very control she had once tried so carefully to preserve. The crown had survived not because the betrayal had been forgotten, but because the truth, however painful, had finally been spoken aloud.